All right, guys. So just stop that. Just saved it, right? Woo. And so here we're going to continue with our evaluation of Descartes, right? As I read this paper to you. Now, again, whatever your preference is, if you need to somehow secure some sort of internet connection, go for a walk, download this so that you can listen as you go to really pay attention, or just sitting on the screen, however you want to do it. Now here we go, and I'll offer a couple of commentary, a bit of commentary as I go through this. So let's try this out really quickly. I want to see if I can. Okay. Now, Descartes was troubled by what he thought. So let me go ahead and say this. This is an overview of Descartes' thought, right? And again, it's going to include those topics that what I've just mentioned in the PowerPoint, my PowerPoint presentation, that is going to be available to you at the end of the course. It's going to mention those topics, right? So just be on the lookout for those. Epistemology, some problems, critiques, that sort of thing, right? Now, Descartes was troubled by what he thought was the impending threat of skepticism, right? And as I mentioned, remember, part of this fear was this lack of consensus, right? This growing sense of something not necessarily true in regards to philosophy. As a result, he desired to construct a methodology and philosophy that would end the acidic effects of the skeptic upon knowledge. You can find this in Rene Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. So anywhere that you see on screen here where I have these footnotes, obviously, just like any sort of academic paper, you can see at the bottom here where I try to note that, right? I'm not just trying to make up stuff, right? Meaning to say that his goal really was to give this gift to the Catholic Church, right? This new philosophy, and to counter skepticism, a growing skepticism that he saw grow in his day and age. You can see this at the bottom. Now, you're probably like, shut up, just continue to get through this, right? Enough commentary for now. Okay, fair enough. Ironically, then, he began his task with the conviction that he must doubt all that can or could possibly be doubted, reduce ideas to either simple, complex ideas, and construct a foundation of knowledge that could operate and build as if all things could be treated as geometric mathematical axioms from the simple to the complex. So he wants to build a philosophy that works like math, right? 2 + 2 is 4. You can't doubt that, right? Nobody's running around arguing whether or not 2 + 2 is 4, but people are running around arguing as to whether or not, natures exist, essence. They're arguing about things. Descartes wants to get rid of that. He wants a philosophy that works like math, right? However, he began his project in the realm of the mind, right? This is rationalism. As will be seen, this was perhaps a dangerous mistake. Once one begins in the mind, then physical and or outside reality is lost unless a bridge is composed that successfully and logically connects the mind to an external reality, which will be addressed. As a result, there was nothing that Descartes felt that he could reduce to a clear and distinct idea, about absent the fear that it was logically possible that an evil demon or a genius, evil genius, mad scientist, whoever, was deceiving his senses, right? This was the argument that he proposed. He doesn't really think there's an evil demon. He's just saying that it's a thought experiment, right? It could be logically possible that he's being deceived, right, by a mad scientist or demon or whatever. Being deceived in regards to his senses. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that all he could do was doubt. Paradoxically, this was his supposed breakthrough. He reasoned that if he were doubting, he could not doubt that he was doubting without finding that he must exist in order to doubt at all. This principle has since been dubbed the cogito ergo sum. Finally, he felt that he had a beginning point to ground his search for certainty, right? The cogito was supposedly his grounding, his beginning point for his search for certainty. He reasoned that he was a thinking thing and thus would ultimately lead to the radical separation of the mind and the material or external world. Now, this is where the mind-body problem began, right, in philosophy. If you've taken a philosophy of mind course, this is where this began. The philosophy of mind begins with the mind-body problem of Descartes. Yet Descartes still could not attain certainty that his body was actually there, as Descartes believed it logically possible that his senses could be deceiving him concerning his body and any external reality. He needed a bridge, as it were, to connect the two. That is to say, what the truths are he has found in his mind, and that there's actually an external world. And this is where Descartes argues that he has an idea of the perfect and infinite God. However, he believed that he himself could not have produced or caused this idea, as he is not perfect nor infinite, as it must be impossible for the finite to imagine the infinite. Listen to that again. His reasoning was that basically it had to be impossible for the finite to imagine the infinite, right, or conceive the infinite in some sense. Therefore, only an infinite God could have caused such an idea. He also reasons from this that God must exist necessarily, as existence must be a perfection in the sense of a predication, and being necessarily perfect. God must therefore exist, as he is perfect and infinite. Now, Descartes believes that his solution to the existence of the material world is found, right? He thinks that, hey, now I can know that there is an external or material world because God is perfect and infinite and could not possibly deceive me, because perfect things it would be an imperfection to deceive, right, or to lie to me or to humanity and whatnot. However, at this point, it must be mentioned that this is where the objection of the supposed Cartesian circle comes into play, as if there were not difficulties already present, but this is being the less severe, it will be addressed at this point. Now, this is supposedly the argument against Descartes' argument for the existence of God there. It's called the Cartesian circle. The question is, how does one know that God exists and is not deceiving you? The answer would be that because of the clear and distinct process of reasoning. One will arrive at the conclusion that God exists and he cannot deceive. But then the question is, well, how does one know that the clear and distinct process of reasoning will lead one to the existence of the non-deceitful God? All right. The answer would be that God is perfectly good and could not deceive you. Therefore, trust this clear and distinct process of reasoning. Hence the alleged circle, right? Because you get the problem, right? You may need to listen to that again, but the point is, well, I can reason to God, and so therefore God wouldn't deceive me because I can reason to God. But the point is, well, how do you reason to God? Well, I'm using my reasoning. Well, how do you know that that's not possibly deceptive, right? You're just arguing in a circle, so the supposed objection goes, right? Now, there are some answers to that, but we're not going to go into those now. The answer would be that God is perfectly good and could not, oh, I'm sorry, I read that. However, this is also devastating to Descartes' system in the sense that Descartes demands clear and distinct principles that cannot be doubted. Yet the very argument offered to escape to the external realm may, at the very least, be questioned regarding its logical necessity. And if its premises can be doubted without contradiction, logically speaking, then, it remains logically possible that it be unsound, which leaves Descartes' own strict criteria to remain unmet. Because remember, Descartes wanted to give these sorts of premises that couldn't possibly be doubted. And if you could possibly doubt them, then they aren't necessarily true. If they aren't necessarily true, then you really don't have any knowledge at all. So would say Descartes. The problem with his argument for God's existence, it's possible that some of those premises be doubted. Not that they're even false, but it's just logically possible that some of these premises may be doubted. Now, as mentioned, Descartes is given credit in the negative sense of initiating the sharp and unfortunate distinction to the mind and body problem, the external world included. That is to say, how do you know there's a world external to you outside of your mind, right? And even were his argument to have been sound, another interesting question was raised. How do the soul and body interact? Descartes believes that this is a difficulty and provides what he believes to be a solution in how the two realities interact with one another. In his day and age, he thought it was through the pineal gland, right? In the back of the head, right? As utterly ridiculous as it sounds, the function of this part of the body was unknown at the time, and Descartes believed that the spirits of a certain sort interacted at this juncture of the body, or that this is the location that the mind and body somehow interacted. Of course, this does not explain at all how they would actually interact, right? Now, that's just a rough overview of part of Descartes' thought, right? We've already talked about a lot of that, but that's just sort of a rough, again, overview. Your text is going to go into much more depth there in that. But I want us to go look at some of these things about how do we know the external world. Is there problems with Descartes' critique of how we might know it's there, and this is going to get into that here. Having given a rough overview of Descartes' thought, it would seem appropriate to question more than a few of the points, principles, and foundations of Descartes' overall system. First, it would seem to be something of a problem that one has to know by the senses that one's senses have deceived him or her in the past. Yet, if Descartes' foundation for methodological doubt is built upon the unreliability of one's senses, it comes as rather odd that it is the same sense, or perceptions in turn, that have served as the corrective to our false or deceived view. So, let me just step back and tell you what some of the arguments there were. Remember, Descartes was saying, he even might have used an example given by Augustine, right? That if you can't trust the senses because they're deceiving you. If I dip the stick into the water, then my senses are telling me that the stick is bent, right? But when I pull out, I see that actually the stick wasn't bent all along. So what's the problem? Well, I can't trust my senses. My senses told me that the stick was bent, right? But why should I trust my senses when I literally can't even trust them enough to know whether or not sticks are bent, right? Or if I'm looking along the highway and I'm pretty sure that there's a puddle of water and I get up closer and it was a mirage or the heat just coming off the highway and there was no water, well, then how can I actually ever be sure that my senses are telling me the truth when I saw the water and it wasn't water, or I saw the stick and it wasn't or the bent stick and it wasn't bent? Or let's say I'm looking across a parking lot and I'm pretty sure that I see Bob, right? And as I get closer, I can tell that my senses deceived me and it wasn't Bob, right? So how could it possibly be that senses can give you knowledge, right? That was his view there, roughly. So, for instance, if one is allegedly unable to trust his senses because of his being deceived by them into assuming that a stick was bent under the water, only to have the stick pulled out to reveal its perfect straightness, then he cannot now say that he knows that his senses are untrustworthy. Upon very close inspection, Descartes' premise comes dangerously close to violating the law of non-contradiction. At best, the law of the principle of consistency, right? He must say that at the same time, in the same sense, that our senses cannot be trusted, while affirming that our senses can be trusted in order to know that our senses cannot be trusted. A is not A at the same time and in the same sense. In fact, Ralph McInerney believes that he does violate the law. Ralph McInerney is a famous philosopher of Notre Dame. In fact, Ralph McInerney believes that he does violate the law of non-contradiction in arguing that, quote, in order to claim that we must dismiss all such judgments as at least dubitable, Descartes must violate the principle of coherence. He must employ P is not P. He must trust his, now this is the key. This is the problem with Descartes' argument there. He must trust his senses in order to doubt them, which implies he cannot universally doubt them. Also, as related but brief parallel, does it not seem rather odd that Descartes does not doubt his doubt? If it is unreasonable that if all things are to be doubted, then doubt itself should receive a pass. Why should that be the case? So let me say what McInerney's saying there. If I look at the stick and I think that it seems to be bent, right? My senses are telling me it's bent. And I pull the stick out of the water. I'm like, aha, look, my senses were deceiving me. It wasn't really bent. What served as the corrective to my belief that the stick was bent? If I look at the stick in the water, think it's bent, and I say, haha, see, I can't, and Descartes says, haha, see, you can't trust your senses. You thought the stick was bent because the senses were telling you that the stick was bent. Well, how did you know the stick wasn't bent? Well, because when I pulled it out, right? But when you pulled the stick out, what were you using to tell you that you were wrong previously? You're using what? Your senses, right? So your senses are serving as the corrective to the false belief, right? When you look across the parking lot, you thought it was Bob. Aha, you can't believe, your senses are deceiving you. You can't believe it's Bob. How do you know? Because when you got closer, you saw it really wasn't Bob. Well, what serves as the corrective to that false belief? The senses, right? Or you're driving along the highway, you're pretty sure there's a puddle. See, you can't believe that you can't trust your senses because you thought there was a puddle. Well, how did you know it wasn't a puddle? Well, because when you got closer, you realized it wasn't a puddle. Oh, I did? And how did I realize that? My senses, right? So McInerney is pointing out the I think devastating critique here to Descartes, saying that we can't trust our senses for the reliability of giving us truth, because Descartes, without realizing it, is having to trust his senses in order to say that his senses are not trustworthy, right? Otherwise, how would you ever know that it wasn't the water in the road? How would you ever know that the stick wasn't bent? How would you ever know that it wasn't Bob? How would you ever know that you weren't dreaming, right? All these sorts of things. You have to know the difference between dreaming and not dreaming, right? In order to try to give an argument that you can't know if you're not dreaming, right? So you see how he's radically violating a principle of consistency or coherence there, right? He's not being consistent or coherent. Now, second, it would seem that perhaps the first mistake of Descartes is his tossing out of the scholastic tradition on the basis of a lack of consensus among philosophers, right? This is something we pointed out earlier. This, in and of itself, seems to be a rather hasty move. After all, if Descartes is of religious convictions, then by that same methodology, he should have constituted a new faith system based upon the fact that there's no consensus among the world religions as to who's correct. Clearly, Descartes recognized, or possibly failed to recognize, that this methodology was unsuitable to religious convictions, as it was still clearly possible that the lack of consensus among religious adherents did not entail that they were all false, right? Maybe one view of faith was or is the correct view. It should seem obvious then that this could have been the case concerning the existing philosophies as well. That's just to say that you can't throw out all prior philosophies because they disagree, just like you couldn't throw out all religions just because they disagree. Maybe one is still true, right? Though one should be very reluctant to affirm any metaphysical system that does not begin with the external world as its beginning point, that is to say, begin with metaphysics or begin with a reality outside of ourselves, there may be something of a slight benefit in something such as the cogito, right? So the cogito would be, again, I think, therefore I am. Is there any benefit to that? Maybe so. Here we go. I do believe that there are some beneficial aspects. One may perhaps employ the cogito ergo sum in the sense that it offers something of a fast track answer to those that may question their own existence, right? Such as college freshmen who embrace the latest trends in New Age thought, by which to deny their own existence and other absurdities, right? So the guy says, how do I know that I exist, right? How do we know that we even exist at all? Well, all right, maybe there's a benefit in using something like Descartes' cogito there, right? Well, because if you're doubting that you exist, you catch yourself existing in order to doubt your own existence. But if you catch yourself existing in order to doubt your own existence, you must exist, right? You can't doubt your own existence if there's nothing there to doubt the doubting, right? And then I put in this parenthetical note here about this is also a starting point of somebody like Norman Geisler's cosmological argument. He begins there, right? Now, yet the major detriment to this, the major detriment is that this, the cogito, is almost all that one may really receive as a positive. The rest of Descartes' method will spiral one into skepticism, to put it rather mildly. It is simply too restrictive in its search for staunch foundationalism. Staunch foundationalism is, again, an epistemological project that you can only have knowledge if you have these clear and distinct ideas that can't possibly be doubted, and you can't get behind them in any shape, form, or fashion, right? That's I hold to some sort of foundationalism in regards to my own personal epistemology, but this strict mathematical type of foundationalism that Descartes was looking for is just pretty much agreed to as it's just not working. The project just won't work. And again, it is impossible to escape the contradicting notion that knowledge must be the ground for the ability to begin the process of doubt, right? You can't begin doubt with basically the presupposition that you know that you're doubting, because you're trying to begin a project of doubt in knowledge, right? That's contradictory. In fact, that's the problem with any sort of skepticism, any sort of radical skepticism. They have to know that they don't know, right? But if you know that you don't know, then you're literally beginning your project, right? Your entire metaphysical or philosophical outwork, rather, your entire epistemological project in the belief that you know something, but your whole point is to argue that you don't really know anything, right? It's contradictory. And again, it's impossible to escape the contradicting notion that knowledge must be the ground for the ability to begin the process of doubt, as one has to know that one's senses have deceived him or her in the past. Descartes does a masterful job of painting himself into a corner. However, the way by which he must work himself out is not so tight as his own system must call for. This is not to say that Descartes does not piece together an argument that could possibly work. Yet Descartes' system, by his own standard, does not call for the possible. Remember, it calls for the undeniable in the same sense that the cogito ergo sum calls for the undeniable, or it calls for undeniability. Descartes is looking for axioms that simply leave no room for doubt. Remember, he wants clear, distinct ideas on the same ground as mathematics, right? For instance, to revisit Descartes' proof for God by another angle, one may realize this argument and its premises do not offer such an axiom that it can't possibly be doubted. And of course, it must be in order to provide the escape. And of course, it must be in order to provide the escape out of his subjective mental cage. He relies on the fact of perceived perfection and concludes that, given our finite nature, that we should have never come to realize the concept of infinite perfection. Therefore, this must be found in God, and then the argument is able to proceed. But why is it that one cannot piece together from other finite objects or concepts one more on into infinity? Is this not even logically possible that one, say, could look at a tree and imagine one to be a foot taller, then 1 foot taller, and then another foot taller, another foot taller, another ad infinitum, or imagine a 100 foot taller, and so ad infinitum? That seems to be at least possible, right? Or, for example, could one not imagine the strength of a finite man and imagine one that were a bit stronger and one that were stronger than he, only to imagine one that could never be bound by anything at all, right? That seems to be possible, meaning that it just seems that human beings are capable of imagining things to be all-powerful, all-wise, etc., by observing finite things of power, intelligence, and so on, and adding to the concept, or perhaps subtracting from what it means to be weak. And again, it would not seem, or it would not mean that it must exist in some such Anselmian fashion, right? Like Anselm's ontological type argument. But the important point is that the above possibilities do not even have to be true. These simply must be possible. And if possible, then Descartes cannot say that they cannot be doubted, right? Because remember, he was looking for things that couldn't be doubted, right? And it seems like it's at least possible that these sorts of things that we're talking about right now could be doubted, right? But this is exactly what his system cannot entertain. If one begins in the head, that is to say, if one begins in the mind, if you're trying to come to the knowledge of reality and you start in the mind through rationalism as opposed to looking at stuff, well, here's a pen, right? If one begins in the head, then it's very hard, to say the least, how one could ever provide an escape route out of that. It seems that one is simply forced to begin with being, that is to say, external reality as an ontological reality outside of oneself. Seems like you have to start there, right? You have to start with metaphysics, not start with epistemology. However, this surely raises a monumental challenge and or question. How does one come to prove this external reality, or less radically, justify believing there to be an external reality? Though it raises challenges, and this is, again, now we're moving into my opinion how we would answer some of these critiques about Descartes' system, about how we know there's actually a reality out here, right? That you're not just dreaming you're watching this video lecture, but you're actually watching this lecture outside of your head, right? There's a lecture here right in front of you that you're listening to. It's not just the product of your own imagination, right? You're not dreaming it. Though it raises the challenge, this author, me, is not so sure that individuals need an escape route from this looming subjectivism, so long as he or she can continue to show that attempts that offer possible defeaters to objective reality can also be offered their own set of defeaters. That is to say, the default view of reality should be the view that one is apt to hold his or her entire life, absent from some philosophical objection that reality cannot be known or justified in any objective sense. And when I say the default view, I mean the view that, like, you think that there's stuff, right? You think there's a pen here. You think there's a sport coat. You're wearing a sport coat. You think there's a door over there, right? The default view of reality, that there really is an external reality that is not just in your head like the Matrix, right? Now, of course, this does not leave one with a proof for objective reality, But if opposing arguments, that there's not an external reality, if opposing arguments can be found to be faulty or especially self-defeating, then one surely has rational justification to hold to the traditional or common sense view that one knows the outside world, right? That you really can know external reality. That is to say, in the absence of an airtight, irrefutable argument that outside reality cannot be known, the fact that humans seem to experience outside reality, and this being an understatement, will always serve as a stronger premise within any argument, conscious or subconscious, for an external world. Let me read that again. That is to say, in the absence of an airtight, irrefutable argument that we cannot know outside reality, the fact what I'm about to say right now, the fact that humans seem to experience outside reality, this being an understatement, will always serve as a stronger premise within any argument, conscious or subconscious, for an external world. Only if one can provide reason that one should not necessarily, and here the word is to be taken literally and in philosophical sense, necessarily. If it can't be shown necessarily, then we shouldn't submit to the conclusions of any arguments for subjectivity, or that is to say that we can't know the external world. Then it is more than reasonable to continue to hold to the truth of an external and knowable world. With that said, are there arguments given that provide a defeater to the belief in an external objective world? Of course there are, right? There are multiple arguments for such a view. One being that Descartes' own system, if one refuses his argument for God, would offer an argument that we can't really know the external world, right? We can't really know reality outside of ourselves. However, it also seems that all of these arguments boil down to either one of the two claims. All right. Now, I want you to really pay attention here, because this is where I'm really going to try to get into the meat potatoes of this whole thing about these arguments against the external world, these arguments that we can't trust our senses. And remember, you may be thinking, well, what does this have to do with Descartes? Because this is what Descartes based his entire system on, is that we can't trust our senses. And so senses can't be the reliable arbiter to the truth, right? Or can't be a reliable harbinger of truth, right? So it seems that all of these sorts of arguments are going to boil down to one of these two claims. One, due to one's utter dependence on sense data, perceptions, impressions, etc., one cannot know the external world, right? So the first being this: due to our utter dependence upon sense data, right, our senses, the impressions, whatever else, one cannot know the external world. Two, due to one's utter dependence on sense data, perceptions, or impressions, one is not justified in his belief of an external or objective world. Notice that these are very similar conclusions, yet the second is more difficult to deal with, as its claim seems to be a little less strong. So the second seems to be a little less difficult because the claim doesn't seem to be strong. The first is saying you can't know. The second is saying, well, I'm not going to be so strong as to say that you can't know that there's an external world, or that you can't trust your senses, but you're just not justified in trusting your senses because of these possible mistakes and whatnot. So they seem similar. The second is a bit stronger because it's less radical, right? The first claim is just immediately self-refuting. It cannot meet the requirements of its own claim. It's just self-defeating, right? For instance, the claim may be reworked to convey what is actually being said. This simply means that for every negation, there must be an affirmation. The only way that one may claim the first objection above is if and only if one can know the external world. How does one know that one cannot know the external world if, in fact, no one can know anything about the external world? One must know something of the external world in order to know that the knowledge that he claims he has of an external world is not true of the external world. Or here may be a different angle by which to see that it's self-defeating. The statement could also be made thusly, right? You could say it this way: we cannot know truths concerning an external world. However, this is itself a truth claim about the external world. If it's true, then it's false, because one may now know a truth concerning the external world, namely that one cannot know truths concerning the external world. On the other hand, if one can know truths of the external world, then surely there may other truths concerning the external world as well could be known, right? It would be special pleading to argue otherwise, and not to mention one would have to know those new truths as they are arguing concerning the external world as well, right? In fact, think of it this way. If someone's trying to argue against you like Descartes, you can't trust your senses, he's trusting his senses, right, that person, in thinking they're looking at you, talking to you, right? But if they can't trust their senses, then how do they know they're arguing with anybody, right? They have to assume, he has to presuppose that he's actually arguing with someone external to him, trying to give an argument that you can't know if there's anything external to yourself, right? See how it violates, again, the principle of consistency there, right? The second claim is more difficult, as it seems to be more humble in its approach. It does not say that one cannot know truths concerning the possibility of the external world. It simply says that, given the arguments for subjectivity, one is now not justified in holding to the view that truths actually can be known in regards to the possibility of an external world, an objective world. However, this claim will also end up self-defeating. It'll also end up defeating itself. First, any argument given for the truthfulness of subjectivity of the external world must assume that there are external objects, at least one other being, namely you or me, at the very least, that the arguments are true for, right? These would necessarily have to be true for all people, right? But if there is a such thing as all people outside of yourself, then your argument that you can't know anything outside of yourself is false, right? Now, where was I? Okay. Of course, if the argument is true for all people, places, and time, even if there were just one other being, regardless of their own view, then this would be an objective truth and not subjective. This is also exactly why a solipsist, right? A solipsist is someone who believes that they're the only person that exists, right? There actually are a few of these, ironically, if you catch that. This is also exactly why a solipsist cannot argue another person into the solipsist camp, because obviously, if solipsism is true, that you're only justified in believing in your own existence, then there's no one else to argue into the view. There's no one else there, right? However, if a real person were argued into the camp, then it fell simply because there was another person, real person, to argue into the camp, right? Lastly, to say that we do not have justification to hold to an external or objective world is simply tantamount to saying that we do not have any justification for holding any truths or theories of an external or objective reality. Of course, that is self-defeating, right? As this itself or that itself must be a justified truth concerning external or objective reality. However, if it is, then one can obviously hold to justified truths concerning a possible external or objective reality. If true, then it's false. Yet on the other hand, if it's true, then the door is open to truths of the external world, and one cannot arbitrarily shut the door to other possibilities concerning it. In order to doubt, it would seem that there must be something to doubt. So, in conclusion, it seems that Descartes began with the pure intent of establishing a philosophical system that would take seriously the ability of the human person to know. And paradoxically, he began his pursuit with the notion of methodological doubt. He believed that his argument for God could escape the conclusion to which his own system fiercely demanded: a radical skepticism that easily slips into solipsism. However, Descartes' supposed airtight, logically necessary proof for God fails in the sense that it simply could not stand under the radical demands of his own system, nor could a number of other principles foundational to his system. Therefore, as was displayed, one is not obligated to hold or oblige the supposed system of knowing that Descartes advised, as these numerous problems allow his system of methodological doubt to be set aside. Now, let's go back to this. So, having said that, right, that gives you a rough overview of Descartes, right? This gives you an overview of Descartes' thought, and then some possible difficulties here. Now, again, I'm going to make the PowerPoint here that you're seeing now available to you at the end of the course, but here basically it just highlights what we just discussed. So the topics mentioned talks about his epistemology, right? His rationalist approach to epistemology, clear, distinct ideas, since they're unreliable. The topics mentioned again, his goals, argument for God. How do we know there's an external world? Again, you see this here. counter to his systems, violates the principle of consistency. So basically, you're going to get in these slides here some of the highlights of what we've talked about in that lecture there to help you remember those points. Hard dualist approach to his view of the soul, right? And just briefly, we talked about how that's influenced even Christian or theistic thought that primarily that you're a soul and you just happen to have willy-nilly a body, that you're not primarily a body and a soul, but you're mainly a soul and you just happen to have a body, right? That sort of thing, how that began with Descartes' hard sort of dualism there. And then our conclusions. I may actually tack on another piece here in regards to Descartes in contrast to a couple other things. In fact, let me look at that. I want to look at that before we get out of here. We can look at it in regards to our conclusions here. Let's see. Yeah. Let's go ahead and pull this up. Now, John Locke, because we're going to go ahead and talk about David Hume in a few lectures. This will give you a little background. Let me go ahead and mention this just for some conclusions in regards to Descartes. So this question here was, how does Descartes argue for our knowledge of an external reality, and how does Descartes and Locke, and then how would that be in contrast to Kant? So I'm going to actually go ahead and mention this because we're going to talk about Kant too. So this will go ahead and at least plant some seeds in your mind. And if you need to pause, right, you can. If you need to pause, go eat something, do something else, then come back to this, you're free to do that. But let me go ahead and read this. Having touched upon this in the paper that we just mentioned, right, this Descartes approach, we're just going to briefly mention that here. Descartes must find a connection to the external world, right? As he has done a masterful job at placing something of a rather tight noose around his neck. He does this by appealing to the existence of a perfect and good God. This is due to the fact that, according to Descartes, a perfect and good God would not be capable, even in principle, to deceive him, that is, deceive Descartes, right, or us, regarding the external world. Therefore, if Descartes could construct an argument that proves the existence of God, then there must be an external world. His desire is to use the notion of perfection and the apparent human inability to come to this notion alone. However, Descartes' criteria for knowledge must be built upon principles that are, for all intents and purposes, undeniable. That is, they must be clear and distinct and axiomatic. Unfortunately, the premises that Descartes offers are not able to withstand his earlier criteria, that which cannot be doubted. At least one, and possibly a few of the premises within Descartes' argument can be doubted, that is, logically speaking. And most are not convinced that his arguments for God work, which would have given him his external reality. Now, and again, we detail that a little more in that quick little paper there. Now, I'll just go ahead and leave off this Locke stuff until we start to talk about Hume and then even Kant here. So yeah, I'm just pulling that up. Hopefully you get something else with that. Oh, this will be good. Compare and contrast one of Descartes' arguments for the existence of God. How they alike and how they different in regards to Locke. What arguments do they play in each of their philosophies? Now, I'm going to go ahead and give you this argument. At least now you're actually getting one of the real arguments for God's existence given by Descartes real quickly here. An outline for Descartes' first argument goes like this, right? 1, something cannot be derived from nothing. All effects are caused by something. There must be as much reality in the cause as there in effect. One has an idea of an infinite and perfect being, which was caused by something. A finite and imperfect being cannot cause an infinite and perfect thought. 6, only an infinite and perfect being could cause as much. 7, an infinite and perfect being exists. So that would be something like Descartes' argument. Now notice that though, Descartes got to get something to the external world, right? Notice all he has is himself so far, right? He's got this idea of himself. You still can't get to the external world just from yourself, right? That's why he's trying to get to God. But his argument for God has the possible problem of the Cartesian circle, right? Now, let me see if there's something else we can pull out here just to toss out something else for you in conclusion. Okay, yeah, I think we can end with that right there in regards to some of the stuff some of the points in regards to Descartes. Again, I'm trusting that you're going along with your reading here filling in some of the gaps here to these supplemental lectures. But I'm hoping that you're finding this lecture to add something even to the reading that you didn't get in the reading. Maybe even speak to even possibly a couple of questions that you would have in regard to how might we respond to something like the heavily rationalist type approach that Descartes takes in regards to epistemology, in regards to his philosophy, right? How do you get to truth, right? Having said that, go just collapse on the floor. I know this was a lot. Take a break, go swimming, jump off a diving board, ride a bike, give your wife a kiss on the cheek, whatever you need to do, hug your kids, get your mind out of the clouds for a minute. See you next lecture, guys.